Good afternoon and welcome to our latest James Wilson Institute webinar. I'm Garrett Snedeker, Deputy Director of the James Wilson Institute. The mission of the James Wilson Institute is to restore to a new generation of lawyers, judges, and ordinary citizens the understanding of the American founders about the first principles of our law and the grounds of our own rights. We're pleased you're with us for a timely discussion about the Electoral College so soon after the 2020 presidential election. Although the dust hasn't quite settled from the election, with the actual convening of electors not until December 14th, pending lawsuits, recounts, and the like, we think there are some yet to be resolved items that only make our discussion today even more timely and relevant. Now, a few more logistical notes before we begin. Rather than a set of prepared remarks, we've decided to conduct this program as more of a conversational style interview. We hope this aligns well with members of our audience participating in this program as an interactive webinar. We'll mix in your questions throughout as appropriate, and we'll also dedicate some time for more formal Q&A towards the end. But we encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A button below. When acknowledged, you may ask your question verbally, or I can ask your question on your behalf. You may also submit an anonymous question. So, if you have any technical questions as well, you should submit those via the Q&A. We'll have one of our staff monitoring the Q&A queue. And now for our featured guest. Michael Maibach is a distinguished fellow for Save Our States, where he manages outreach to academics, policy professionals, and allied organizations in defense of the Electoral College. Friends of the James Wilson Institute know him well, since he's also been a member of our Board of Trustees since 2015 and our Managing Director since 2016. I've had the great pleasure of working alongside Michael for this entire time. From 2003 to 2012, Michael was the president of the European American Business Council. In 1983, he established the Intel Corporation's Government Affairs Department. At Intel, he built a global team of 150 plus professionals during his 18 years at the company and became Intel's first VP of Global Government Affairs. While a college student under the great Straussians Herbert Storing and Martin Diamond, Michael was a governor's fellow in Illinois and was elected to the DeKalb County Board as the first person elected to public office under 21 years of age in U.S. history. Michael, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Garrett. Just delighted to be here, and thank you for the kind introduction.
Fantastic. Before we delve into the history, structure, and practical workability of the Electoral College, let's go straight to what's likely on everyone's mind right now. How did the Electoral College shape the 2020 election and now its aftermath?
Well, it shapes every presidential campaign because we really have 50 Democratic elections in the 50 states. So, for example, ask yourself, where was Mr. Trump in his last night of campaigning on November 2nd, the day before the election? At about 10 p.m. He was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, not New York City, not Los Angeles, not Chicago, not Miami or Houston, not the major metro areas, because he was attempting to win the state of Michigan. And very often, whether it was Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump, they were in smaller towns trying to shore up their support in key states, frankly, mostly in the Midwest.
Do you think that the Electoral College worked, or at least it worked as it should have, or did the Electoral College perhaps provide both candidates, Biden and Trump, with incentives to not pursue what might be in their interest in gathering as many raw votes as possible?
Yeah, it works very well for this republic. We're, as Madison wrote in Federalist 51, we are a compound republic, a nation of states. Matter of fact, the Constitution didn't create the states created the Constitution, and people have to keep that in mind. The system worked very well, and right now we're going through a lot of turmoil about recounts and court cases in Pennsylvania, Michigan, well, until last night, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia is still recounting, and there's some counter-attempts in Arizona and Nevada. But I point out, if you saw the movie Titanic, you know that because the separate compartments in the ship were not all the way to the top once the bow was breached by the iceberg and the water came in, and then the compartments one after another sunk or filled with water. They knew when the ship would actually sink based on that. The states are like compartments in an ocean liner of our republic, but they are secure in that when we have a recount, like in Florida in 2000, or we have electoral court cases or other challenges to the system, they're all isolated to each state. Just think if in 2000, Bush v. Gore, rather than a recount in Florida, we had a recount nationally. And this time we had 153, I think it is, million people voting, more than any time in history. To recount all those ballots would be virtually impossible and throw the republic into a crisis.
So let's take a step back. Why did the framers of the Constitution create the Electoral College? What was the original purpose?
Well, it was the last thing they did on the last week of the convention. The first week of the convention, June 1st, they voted under the Virginia plan, this was Randolph primarily, to have the Congress elect the president, and for a 7-year term that could not be repeated. And that was the decision they made early on. Then someone raised the question, well, what if the House and Senate don't agree on who should be the president? Should they meet in a joint session? Should every state just get one vote? And then Eldridge Gary later that month said, why don't we have the governors elect the president? And Mr. Madison opposed actually a congressional election because he said then the chief executive would be a tool, if you will, or a creature of the Congress, and they would not have independence. Mr. Washington, while he was silent in the convention on this question, quietly was telling people when he was the head of the Revolutionary Forces for 7 years that he had no president to meet with. There was no commander in chief. Matter of fact, one of the revolutionary things about the Constitution was the presidency in the end, because the Articles did not have such a person with those kinds of powers. So the convention went back and forth. Someone recommended that we have a national popular vote. That got one vote from one state, and the rest voted against national popular vote. In the end, it was the last thing they did. The Committee of Detail, also called the Committee of 11, included Wilson and Madison. Wilson early on in June had suggested presidential electors, and he might have gotten this from the Roman Republic, this idea, but it was put aside because his idea was they would all convene in the Capitol, all these electors from the different states, sort of a Republican versus a Democratic device of representation, one-time electors. But Wilson and Madison returned to this idea, and when they came out of the committee after the recess was over, they had the solution, which was the Electoral College. And if no one won the majority in the Electoral College, the Senate was to break the tie. Well, the only amendment that was made to this scheme was the delegates said the Senate approves treaties and ambassadors and cabinet positions. We don't want to have that conflict of interest. Let's have the House break the tie. And of course, this happened in 1828 between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. But in the House, the delegations all get one vote per state. So it's a little complicated explanation, but it was the last thing they did because it was the hardest thing they did. They were creating something new, which was an independent executive. Finally, their goal was to have an independent and energetic president. This is Federalist 68 and 70 by Hamilton. They wanted to have a check on the Congress, and they wanted to have national leadership in time of crisis. And the presidency meets those three tests.
So I do want to ask just practically how the Electoral College works, but just while we're on the subject of how the Electoral College was assuming that how the electors would act. How did the Constitution reflect the assumption that political parties were not guaranteed to dominate the process? Before the 12th Amendment, we had, of course, the president and the vice president as the number one and the number two vote getters in the Electoral College. But why was there this assumption built into the Electoral College's original framework, that there would be more of Republican deliberation rather than a rubber stamp that we might say today?
A Republican
deliberation where the electors would actually meet to count up votes for who would be president and then vice president. It was the number one and the number two vote getters until the 12th Amendment.
I think it's fair to say the founders assumed that the leading men, in those days just men, in each state would rise to prominence and success and be well known enough to run nationally, if you will. In that case, 13 states was the nation. So they hoped that the electors would be so well informed and know even these people personally, perhaps, because they were leading lights in their own state, being elected by the citizens of their states, that they would know the reputations, and to make sure, as sort of a safeguard, that we would have a good person elected president and not someone, let's say, that was known to be conniving with the French or the British or some other foreign power, because there was a lot of fear of European interference. And it's even found in the Federalist Papers about Hamilton saying Europe tries to be the mistress of the world, regulating us into passive existence. So Hamilton and others were very worried about a president who would do the bidding of a foreign power. As a matter of fact, that's one of the amendments they made to the Constitution in the August recess, was to make sure that he was native born.
Michael, you've been giving talks on the Electoral College now for the better part of a year and a half, 2 years. But your most prominent, and of course on webinars as well, but your most prominent talks on the Electoral College may have been in a movie that was released not too long ago called Safeguard, an Electoral College Story. And in the movie, which is, by the way, streaming on Amazon for anybody interested after our webinar today. But in the movie, you liken the Electoral College and its function to an analogy between how in a playoff series in baseball, one team may score more runs over the course of a series, but another team may win more games, and the Electoral College rewards the winning of games, not the scoring of runs. So how does that play into the Electoral College's design?
Right. Indeed, we've had in American baseball history World Series where the losing team has scored more runs over the course of the World Series, as you say, and yet someone else won the most games. I like to ask people, when Mrs. Pelosi runs for Speaker in January of next year, is it because the Democratic Party won the most votes throughout the nation in House races? Or did they win the most games? In other words, the most seats. That's how we do things in this republic. And this is the case with Virginia. We have a state senate that has in Virginia a one seat difference, 49 to 51. 2 years ago, now it's 45-55, but it's not 100% one party or the other, even though one party won the majority of voters in the state of Virginia. We use districts to disaggregate power and to represent local interest and regional interests. And so the states are the same. Lincoln in 1860, because there were 4 candidates, only got 30 9.8% of the vote.
Right.
60% of the people voted against Lincoln, but he won 18 of the 33 states. He won the majority of the states, and therefore he was seen as legitimately elected because we truly were a nation of states then. My gosh, by the time he was sworn in on March 4th, 1861, 6 states had already left the Union, and they didn't leave as cities, they left as states.
Mm. So how are electors themselves selected?
Well, every state is every state legislature decides how electors are chosen. They could choose them themselves, but a long time ago, in the 19th century, it was decided by virtually every state that electors are chosen by political parties. So, for example, May of this year, 2020, the Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, and other parties that exist in Virginia, all within their own party caucuses, chose their electors. And I actually was chosen by my party in May to be an elector for Virginia if a certain presidential candidate was elected. So you're chosen by your peers within your party. And so you have all these sets of electors, but only the winning set goes to Richmond, our state capital, December 14th. And one of the things Hamilton points out in Federalist 70 is that because we have all the electors meeting in now 50 state capitals, there is no chance for cabal because they're all dissipated into their capitals and only can talk among themselves and not as some sort of a national convention, if you will. So that's another safeguard, as the movie is called, that we've produced at Save Our States.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good system. And people ask, well, what keeps you from voting against the wishes of your party? Well, in my case, and by the way, we do it in Virginia by congressional districts. So every district has an elector and then 2 at large are elected by each party. So in my case, 223 people signed up for the 8th Congressional District Convention. Because of COVID, rather than meeting them and speaking in person to them, I made 222 phone calls. And I talked to each one of them. And the first and only thing they said was, if our party wins in Virginia, will you support our party's nominee? And I said, absolutely. And I gave my word. And honestly, anybody that gives their word in society to 200 or more people and is publicly known to have given their word, then goes back on it. I guess you can legally do that as an elector, but people will never trust you again.
Mm-hmm.
And what is more important in society in a civic sense than trust?
Yeah, I can only imagine in the close run, at least electorally, and in Florida, a close run election in 2000, where if you had 1 or 2 defections, you would have thrown it either into the House or it would have been thrown to the other candidate. So it very much can have large ramifications. I wanted to get into a little bit more about the philosophy behind the Electoral College and draw it out because I think defenders of the Electoral College are meeting opponents who are not content to be persuaded by appeals to tradition or stability. Can you go into a little bit more about what the philosophy behind adding this additional layer to our democratic process? What kind of other virtues it appeals to?
Okay. And first, I will recommend to our audience a book called The Philosophy of the American Constitution by Paul Eidelberg, forward by Herbert Storing, who was one of my wonderful professors. The founders were students of history. Matter of fact, some of the founders read both ancient Greek and Roman or Latin in those documents. Socrates was put to death by the majority rule of Athens for asking questions of the youth, for corrupting the youth. This led Plato to start the academy, the first university, if you will, and he wrote a book called The Republic, in which he said all democracies naturally tend to tyrannies, because he was a witness on the hillside there in Athens of the trial of his teacher, Socrates. His famous student, Aristotle, wrote a book called The Politics, wherein he dealt with the problem of democracy and said that the only successful self-government system would be a mixed regime, the executive, the legislative, and the people. Now, he put it in different terms, but the Romans took that to heart, and they had the Caesar, they had the Senate, and then they had the aristocrats, or the oligarchs, if you will, who were also part of the Roman Republic. So this idea of checks and balances, and it worked out for 400 and some years in Rome before it became a Roman empire instead of a republic. Montesquieu, and as well, Cicero wrote a book called The Republic, which goes into this. Montesquieu, his famous book, The Spirit of the Laws, in 1748, when James Wilson was 5 years old, it was published. And the founders read Montesquieu. They read their Montesquieu. He had spent 20 years studying why democracies fail, and he came up with the modern version of checks and balances. So by the time they come to Philadelphia, and they're going to write, which is now the world's oldest constitution, other than the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts, which has the oldest constitution, which was partially written by John Adams. They were determined to do one central thing. And it wasn't to make the majority rule all the time. It was to protect minority rights so people would be free. And that was their central challenge. Majority rule is an important principle, but alone it is a tyrannical principle. And minority rights is a freedom principle. And so they have checks and balances, what Madison calls in Federalist 51, a compound republic, where you have the House checks the Senate. The Congress checks the president, and the president has a veto over that. And then the courts have a say in all of this. And in the end, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And the word law in Latin means to bind. And the whole idea was to bind men and women in society with the law, with the Constitution, so that we would be free. And so those that just say the majority ought to rule, I ask them, well, what do all those great philosophers have to say about that? That is a radical idea. If your only principle is majority rule.
Right. And I'm sure we can do comparative studies about how other republics select their leaders. But how do most elect their head of state?
This is a fascinating topic I get to, especially with college students when I speak with them. There's 28 member states in the European Union, soon to be 27. The UK is going to leave at the end of December. Of the 28, only 2 elect their head of government by a popular vote. That's France and Cyprus. France has a runoff election, as you know. The rest have a Republican form, and it's very wary of majority rule. Their parliaments elect. And I like to point out to students, Margaret Thatcher, Boris Johnson, Winston Churchill were never on the ballot of all of the United Kingdom, only their own constituencies. Mrs. Merkel has been Chancellor of Germany for a decade. She's only on the ballot in her region in Eastern Germany. And then her parliament, called the Bundestag, elects her. Canada, Israel, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, India, Norway, Morocco, all of those republics elect their head of government through their parliament. We have vastly more democracy in electing our president. We have 50 popular elections. They have none in those countries. Now, who has popular election of their head of government? Iran, Venezuela, Nicaragua. That's a sobering fact. No, our system is a hybrid of republicanism and democratic philosophy, and that's how the founders designed it with, as I said, #1 goal, protecting individual liberties. In Federalist 84, Hamilton says because there were some in the New York Convention, ratifying convention, saying we need a Bill of Rights because in 1776, George Mason had written the Virginia Bill of Rights, and some other states had Bill of Rights in their constitution, to which Hamilton said in Federalist 84, the entire Constitution is a Bill of Rights because it's checking power at all times and it disperses power to the states, etc., so it's not needed. However, it was a very close vote in New York, and I am supposing, and only supposing, that he and Madison took this to heart. And the first thing Madison did in the first Congress under the Constitution was draft the Bill of Rights, 15 in the original form, 12 survived through the Congress, and 10, and we have the Bill of Rights today. And we have the Bill of Rights because the founders wanted to nail that totally. And now today we have the governor of New York talking about closing churches and synagogues and mosques. And this is being appealed to the Supreme Court. As Paul Eidenberg says in his book, The Philosophy of the American Constitution, all great questions of American politics in the end are questions dealt with by the Constitution.
We'll take it from the international comparative sphere down to some more practical considerations going forward with the Electoral College. So opponents at present argue that the current system favors Republicans. They look to how Republicans have won the popular vote for president only once since 1988, and yet Republicans have won the White House 3 times. Democrats are among the most numerous current critics of the Electoral College for this reason. However, is this criticism short-sighted?
Well, this criticism is, again, from people that have just one governance principle, and that is the majority must always rule, and the minority, including closing churches and synagogues, etc., must always give way to the majority. So that principle misses the fact that we are a nation of states. The states created this union. They voted 9-1 in the Constitutional Convention against national popular vote. Only one of the Pennsylvania delegates voted for it, because Philadelphia was the largest city in the country in those days. So those that are for a national popular vote forget the principles of the founding and, frankly, the Constitution that all states accepted. Matter of fact, every state, including California, that joined the Union had to sign on to the Constitution, and their legislature had to uphold the Constitution. The other thing I want to mention is sort of an important but totally neglected fact. It takes about 2 or 3 acres to feed each person. So if there's 9 million people in New York City, which there are, let's say there's 20 million acres that have to be farmed. Corn and wheat and soybeans and cows and chickens and all the rest, all the cattle, to feed those people. And therefore, they can't have high populations in Iowa or Nebraska or the places where these crops are grown to feed the cities. And if we're going to have a national popular vote, it will be ruled by the cities. Los Angeles County has more people than 41 of our states. New York City has more people than 39 of our states. Nassau County, which is one of the 3 counties on Long Island, not part of New York City, has more people than 10 of our states in Nassau County. If you want to have national popular vote, we will have rule by the major cities, and we will turn most of the American people into serfs. They will be feeding the cities and know they will never have a choice that's important as president. And if you want to do that to this republic, that is the way to end the republic, because 9 states have 51% of our people, and the other 41 have 49%. And so if we want to keep a republic, we have to remember that we have to feed the republic, and you cannot do that in the farms in New York City. There are no farms in New York City, and they, I don't think, always appreciate the fact that somebody has to use a lot of land that is not populated with people, but populated with plants and animals in order to keep this nation of ours fed and healthy.
That's quite astute. Our pal Sean Trendy at Real Clear Politics makes an argument along a little bit different lines than the ones you made. Sean says that the reason why it seems that the national popular vote is so convincing for Democrats is only because the current rules of the game, meaning to elect the president, have produced this outcome. The counterfactual of let's have a national popular vote, it has never been tried, and Republicans have never had the electoral incentive to try and capture votes in places that you've just described, Los Angeles County, New York City, in the past 20, 30 years. It may very well be that if you change to a national popular vote, Republican efforts would shift away from Nevada and let's see, where's another state? Michigan, to go for where you've just described, right? Nassau County, places where their vote tallies have fallen off in recent years. It seems to me that to argue that it's a foregone conclusion that Democrats would do better in a national popular vote is far from certain. Would you agree?
Well, not only that, there are so many radical risks of a national popular vote. Let's just talk about a couple of them. Right now, our first primary is actually called a caucus, the Iowa caucus. And the first official primary is in New Hampshire. Why in a country of 320 million people, a continental republic with huge states and huge cities, do we start our political process with an agricultural land like Iowa, and then small shops and small merchants and small government in New Hampshire? We start that process because it's a reminder we want the presidential candidates to appeal not only to the big cities. Matter of fact, ask yourself the question, in the countries in Europe, where are the capital cities? They're always in the biggest cities. Rome, Paris, Berlin, London, on and on and on, Madrid. In the United States, our genius is the following. Where are capital cities? Richmond, Virginia, Springfield, Illinois, Ann Arbor, Michigan. They purposely, the people that created this country and these states said, we don't want the capital in the biggest city. It's Sacramento, it's not Los Angeles, right? Carson City, etc. It's not St. Louis, it's Carson City, on and on and on. This is the design of the founders. Number two, if we didn't have the Electoral College, we had national popular vote, we would not have this wonderful two-party system, which allows 300 million people to self-govern. We would have 12 parties. In the last 4 years, the Spanish Parliament has had 4 different prime ministers because they have over 7 parties. The British in the last 4 years have had 3 different prime ministers, Cameron, May, and now Boris Johnson. The Italian government has had 1 new president per year since the Second World War. You want to have instability. We have great stability because we have a two-party system which creates this binary choice. It's only the fact because we have the Electoral College. You take that away and Mr. Zuckerberg with his billions will say, I'm going to run for president. I don't have to play the party game. I'll just fly from big city to big city in my personal jet and spend all I need to do and with PR, etc. And I'll just appeal to the cities. And how will everyone feel about that? We won't be able to organize the House of Representatives. We'll have a new speaker every 6 months because there'll be a coalition government, which is what they've been doing in Spain. September of last year, 2019, the Likud party was elected the majority in the Israeli parliament. They have 110 members, but they have 10 parties in among their 10. And it took them from September until May of this year to choose Netanyahu as their new prime minister. They had 6 months without a prime minister because they couldn't aggregate a coalition government, which they always have in Israel. So the multi-party system, if you don't like gridlock, I tell you, put a multi-party system in the U.S. House and Senate. And in the presidential race, you'll have a president elected with 25% of the vote.
Oh boy.
The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is 15 legislatures have passed, has no runoff, has no 40%. It's just whoever wins the vote. And if you want to have a president with 20 or 30 or 40% of the vote and have 60, 70% of the people not with that person, there is no mandate and there is no leadership. So I get a little bit worked up about this because we take so much for granted, whether it's how our cities are fed by the rural areas or how this political parties, the system that we have, brings such stability to this continental republic.
I do want to ask you a little bit more about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, since it bears strongly on your work with Save Our State. But before we get into that, I'd like to encourage our viewers and our listeners to please submit your questions to the Q&A because we'll soon be turning to them, and we do want to bring them forth. This is going to be an interactive webinar. But Michael, Colorado just passed Proposition 113, which was a resolution to award electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. What would make the voters of Colorado want this? And then would this even pass constitutional muster?
So the facts in Colorado are that the Colorado legislature and governor were one of the 15 states that enacted the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which does not go into effect in these 15 states until they reach 270 electors. So this is an attempt to amend the Constitution rather than with 38 states, with about 20 states. They're up to 196 electors now, and the bill is pending before the Virginia legislature. What happened in Colorado was because they were part of the progressive era when they became a state, they have initiative, referendum, and recall. And therefore, the first time in Colorado history since 1936, citizens put together a referendum to actually repeal the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. But this was pretty much a party line vote. They voted for a new U.S. Senator, the Democrat, former Governor Hickenlooper, and they voted for Mr. Biden. And so part of the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party in that state was also enact this, which is make sure that the national popular vote wins, even if the people of Colorado vote for a different person.
Mm-hmm. But do you think it will pass constitutional muster, or is this something that can just pass through ordinary legislation in Congress if they tried?
So the Article 1 has the Compact Clause, as you know. The Compact Clause was written by the founding states, most of which were very small. You know, when in the Constitutional Convention, written in the room behind me here, Virginia had 750,000 people. Georgia had 75,000 people, 1/10, and Delaware had 59,000, and Rhode Island had fewer than that. So the small states were about 9, and the large states were about 4. It was Massachusetts, which included Maine at the time, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina. Those were the biggest states, and New York, the fifth one, New York. And so the founders said, we don't want to have compacts with a few of the states. One of the things they feared was trade agreements or other compacts among the states that would negate trade freely across the republic, but also deals with foreign countries. You know, the French still had the Louisiana Territory. We had fought a war with France. The Spanish had Florida, etc. We were surrounded. The British were in Canada. We were surrounded by Europeans, and they didn't want some states ganging up on other states. This National Popular Vote Interstate Compact has not even been dealt with in one hearing before the Congress because they know that even the Democrat majority states will not allow for an amendment to the Constitution, and I think it would get voted down, and they don't want to do that. Instead, what they're aiming to do is create a constitutional crisis. And that's bad, But when people want to have majority tyranny, this is this is a lack of concern in terms of the fabric of the republic.
Mm. How would campaigning be different with some states as part of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact and others not?
Well, it doesn't go into effect until they have 270 electoral votes. But one would think that once it went into effect, and California was the first one to pass this, it was devised by a fellow named John Koza, who invented the scratch-off lottery ticket and was a fan. So he's a very wealthy guy. Every time you buy a lottery ticket, he makes money. So please don't buy lottery tickets. But Koza has used his millions of dollars. He's a professor at Stanford, I think a professor of mathematics. But he's used his money to fund this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And because he thought Al Gore, who had the popular vote, won, I think by 300,000 votes approximately against Bush, should have won. He was a majority rule guy. And so he started this. And then when Trump won, then it became an effort on steroids. I think that people would campaign in those states differently than the other states. They would campaign in the states that have passed this, in other words, the large cities. But because, I think presidential candidates, if they knew the compact was in effect, would simply campaign in all the large cities. You know, Mr. Trump said that he won by playing by the rules. In other words, they got the most electoral votes, not the most popular vote. He said, I'd have a very different campaign if we had different rules. And of course, every candidate would. That's just you know, if there's 5 strikes, you're out instead of 3, we'll have a different kind of pitching staff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely that same kind of problem with you know, running a counterfactual, but with different rules, becomes ensnarled with too many different what ifs. Let's imagine the United States of America without the Electoral College, even beyond just our sort of elections process. How is that different than the America we know?
Well, the Electoral College is all about how we choose our president. And one of the things about American history is we mark our history by our presidents, right? And the states elect the president because we're a nation of states and we use the Electoral College. And our presidential campaigns have always been about the states. Mm-hmm. The United States without the Electoral College, one cannot imagine the Constitution without the Electoral College because the presidency itself would be so different. You would think of France or Egypt as unitary states. They don't have the political subdivisions we do. The United Kingdom has Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England. They have some you know, atomization of their political base, if you will. But we are, like the Germans, we're a federal republic, and like the Swiss, we're truly a federal republic, as is Canada. They have 11 provinces and I think 3 territories. So most republics are attracted to this idea of having governments within governments. You know, just think of what's going on with COVID right now, where Mr. Biden says, well, maybe we ought to have a national mask rule. Well, is New York City the same as Montana, where you see a lot more cattle than people? Or when we discussed now, Mr. Biden has talked about a $15 an hour minimum wage, as if the cost of living in Los Angeles is the same as the cost of living in Des Moines, Iowa. It's just not. So this whole idea of disaggregating governance to meet the local constituencies where they live and how they live, and their economies and their way of life is very important to our republic. We would not be happy without the Electoral College, and the Constitution probably would not survive because so many states, 40 states or so, would be looking for exits from the Union.
Excellent. Yeah. No, I think that's right. The Electoral College binds as much as anything. So we have a few questions in the queue, and we encourage you to bring forth more of them. The first question comes from Paul Provence. Paul asks, would the adoption of ranked choice voting, as in Maine, reverse your concern about the president being elected by a minority of voters?
Well, Paul's a friend. Hello, Paul. I think what he's talking about is what Nebraska and Maine do in terms of having congressional districts assign their electors. Whoever, for example, I think Mr. Trump won one congressional district in Maine. If that's what he's talking about.
Sure. No, I think that it could be two ways. So, go ahead with that one. And
okay, I think he may be referring to where you choose more than one person for an office, and then there's sort of a runoff effect.
Yeah, that's probably the other way it could be understood. So no, go both of them, sure.
Yeah, I think if state legislatures want to decide to disaggregate their electors like Nebraska and Maine do, I think that's within their right, and the founders would say that's constitutional. You can do it. The reason states don't do it is because candidates are attracted to visiting states to get the entire prize and not just one or two congressional districts. But that's a reform some states might want to engage with. What he's talking about, I think Paul's talking about, is where you would rank voters or votes on for different candidates. I do think our first past the post or majority rule wins in each district of the Congress, the legislature, is the best way to have a coherent legislative majority to actually have the organization of Congress or the state legislature. Maine does the ranked choice, but I don't think it will serve us well. I think it'll create an awful lot of governance problems because no one can be held responsible when so many are partially responsible. Mm-hmm. In other words, you have no ruling party to throw in or out because, we're a coalition government, and we're only 1/3 of the coalition in the legislature or the Congress. It's hard to keep anybody. So right now, for example, the Democrats have the Democratic Party has a very slim majority in the U.S. House, and if people are unhappy 2 years from now, they can move to have the Republicans rule the House for 2 years. But if you had 3 or 4 or 5 parties there, and you're unhappy, how do you hold anybody responsible? In a country this large, the binary system serves us very well. We inherited from the British, and I think it's the best way for us to go. Reasonable people can differ on this.
Right. It strikes me that the best argument for ranked choice voting is that you, at the very least, are bringing forth candidates that might not have the ability to get over 50% in a multi-candidate election, but you would at least have them be able to be put up against another candidate in a second, whatever you want to call it, like a second wave, and then you may build in the legitimacy of a candidate getting over 50% when compared. The counter to that is the problem we have in California at the congressional level, right? Where you have districts and then the whole state, which are captured by Democrats, and Republicans are effectively locked out from general elections, though, right?
Well, in the presidential, they're typically there's always, but every state has a minority and a majority. It's just in California, they have 40 million people, so it sounds big. But I would point out, apropos to this discussion, look what's happening in Georgia. In January, there's going to be a runoff for 2 U.S. Senate races in Georgia because they have a majority rule, which is you have to have 50% of the vote to win. Just think if every state did that. Then all you have to do is have third and fourth parties created, and all of a sudden we have 20, 30, 40 runoff elections in the U.S. Senate? Do we really want to put the Republic through 50 Georgias? You're going to see an awful lot of pressure in Georgia, but my gosh, I think the winner take all, whoever gets the plurality, is a good way to run there is no perfect self-governance system, and the founders were clear about that. The progressive mind thinks there's perfection somewhere, and that we just have to have more taxation and more regulation until we reach perfection. The founders were very sober about the problem of the human condition. To be a conservative, in my humble opinion, is to understand that man's nature is broken, always has been, always will be. And that's why Mr. Montesquieu and Aristotle and others said, we've got to have a mixed regime or we're going to have tyranny. And because, as Socrates says, all majority rule systems turn into tyranny. And so we have to dissipate that power through districts, through one of the beauties of the Constitution, every 2 years the House, every 4 years the presidency, every 6 years the Senate can change hands, etc. And so we also dissipate these flows of history so that you have to have 4 or 6 years of an idea for it to really take hold. And it takes typically 3 or 4 years for one idea to get through the U.S. Congress and signed by the president. So we have a lot of cooling of the teacup by the Senate and other devices.
Right. And just so our friends know, our dear senior scholar, Michael Uhlman, who passed last year, was one of just the foremost authorities on the arguments in favor of the Electoral College. And we'll follow up this program by sharing that essay. It was so influential that it actually persuaded several senators to change their minds. Michael brought up in the 70s, there were a couple of efforts to repeal the Electoral College, and Michael Uhlman, who was working as a Senate aide at that point for Senator Ruska of Nebraska, he was behind that effort to preserve it. And it was one of those rare instances when a memo that was shared just between Senate offices in the minority. This was the minority opinion at the time. It actually was more powerful and persuasive in changing the minds of those senators to abandon that effort. One might compare it to Scalia's opinion in Morrison versus Olson on the independent counsel, the dissent that now is accepted as the wisdom.
On that, in 1970, President Nixon endorsed the abolition of the Electoral College, and Senator Eugene McCarthy, a very well-known Democrat at the time and considered quite progressive, opposed it. In 1977, they tried again, and Jimmy Carter endorsed the abolition of the Electoral College, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, another Democrat in the Senate, championed the protection of the Electoral College. Moynihan's speech on the floor of the U.S. Senate, which extended almost an hour, is a brilliant thing to read, as is Michael Uhlman's writings on the same topic. If you go to saveourstates.com, we have under resources, essays, testimony, videos, podcasts. This will be posted there, I hope, someday. So our guests can also go to saveourstates.com or the Center for the Electoral College.us. They both have lots of resources. John Kennedy was a fan of the Electoral College. And by the way, in 1922 or 1928, I have to check, but when FDR was governor of New York, he gives a wonderful speech in defense of federalism. And he says, in effect, at the end, we wouldn't have a nation if we didn't reflect the very different natures and regions and interests of the states. It's a wonderful, wonderful argument for the Electoral College, of course, and then he went on to be president, but he was for the Electoral College. So you have a lot of members of the Democratic Party throughout history that were for the Electoral College. That's not the case so much anymore with that particular party.
Mr. Silver asks, in the 1992 presidential election, Bill Clinton got 14 million fewer popular votes than George H.W. Bush and Ross Perot put together, but Clinton received 370 electoral votes. Why do you think Clinton was not generally considered an illegitimate president, or at least not until his second term?
Well, he won the plurality of the vote, and he won the majority of the Electoral College vote. So he had a double victory, I guess you would say. And it is ironic. We've had two, in our recent history, two major third-party candidates. Eugene Debs ran, I think, 4, maybe 5 times, but 4 times.
Right.
In one election.
Once from jail.
Yeah, once from jail. And he got up to, in one election, 20% of the popular vote, not one Electoral College vote. And Ross Perot got 20% of the vote when he ran in '92, and not one electoral vote, which is a message to all third-party candidates in America, which is, if you're serious about being president, you have to get on one of the two teams. If you just want to undermine another candidate, you run for that reason. If Ralph Nader had not been on the ballot in Florida, Al Gore would have won Florida. So third parties can have an impact, but they can't get elected president, and therefore very often they don't try, or not very hard, because of our two-party system is reinforced by the Electoral College. And I think that's to our benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Not perfect, but it's to our benefit.
Yeah, I'm remembering back in 2012, Mitt Romney had to play very nice with Trump, because that was the fear in 2012, that Trump would run third party and dash Romney's chances of keeping a unified Republican Party together.
Yeah.
But I mean, this has happened throughout our history, where third parties, they play spoiler, but they don't have a realistic chance of capturing the White House. We have a question from our founder and director, Hadley Arcus, who wanted to ask another question specific to an election in the 20th century. In 1960, Kennedy had a margin of only 8,000 in Illinois, which could be contested, and then a 40,000 vote margin in Texas with, of course, Lyndon Johnson on the ballot. What would a recount have looked like back then?
That's a great question. Matter of fact, Nixon struggled with this question, because Nixon assumed that Mayor Daley, being a Catholic, powerful political leader, was supportive of the first Catholic president, John Kennedy. And the thought was that Illinois only went for Kennedy because of all the cemeteries in the Chicago area that voted, all the extra votes. Lincoln discussed with his attorneys whether to challenge and ask for a recount. And he decided, the way I understand the history, that this would throw the Republic into turmoil. And matter of fact, what if it was discovered that there had been corruption in Illinois and had thrown the state, what that would do to respect for our election system in general. So Nixon, I think to his great credit, decided not to make this an issue. He and Kennedy were both in the Senate and were friends. And so he let this pass. Of course, Lyndon Johnson, there was a lot of shenanigans going on in Texas as well. And we had shenanigans in Pennsylvania. I think one of the 44 of our 50 states have changed their election law this year, and not all constitutionally. It's supposed to be by the legislature. The Supreme Court's going to have to rule on this in the Pennsylvania case. No matter who's president, you can't have state officials changing election law without the state legislatures passing those laws.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right. We have a question from Chris Kaup, and Chris is harkening back to a point you brought up earlier in your lecture. He asks, wouldn't a national popular vote for president be consistent with James Wilson's initial arguments on elections to the presidency at the Constitutional Convention?
Well, Wilson did not want a national popular vote by ballot. He was for, he was the one that early the first week of June brought up the idea of electors. But I'm not. I'd have to be shown the passage in Madison's notes where Wilson was for a national popular vote itself. I might be wrong on that, but he wanted to curb that with the Electoral College, and then he persuaded Madison on that eventually. But I'll do some research on that for that. It's a good question, but I'm not familiar with Wilson being for a simple national popular vote, but he might have been in early days.
I do want to make sure that again our audience has ample opportunity to ask questions, and as we wind down, we'll kind of do one more pass to make sure that our audience has questions. But just to Michael on a subject that we've been building towards for the 2024 election, with hopes that Democrats had for abolishing the Electoral Colleges themselves seemingly abolished. What does the defense of the Electoral College command of us today? Does the 2020 election be viewed as a strong vote to dash those extreme hopes, or was the 2020 election inconclusive and the same kind of pressures that pre-existed it, those are still there and as strong as ever?
So the system worked. Biden got the majority of the vote, and he won I think he won the majority of the Electoral College. It hasn't been until December 14th. It hasn't been certified yet by the electors, but I think that'll happen. And so the system worked. And Biden and Trump played by the rules of the Constitution by campaigning. I mean, Biden didn't do a lot of campaigning, but he was in Georgia, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I think that's the only places he visited. Maybe he went out west once. That might have been the case in Nevada, or maybe it was Nevada. But they really went to the states that were on the bubble. And the thing is, states change. From election to election. It used to be there's something called the Solid South, it was all Democratic, right? And California gave us Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. It used to be a Republican state. So states change. I grew up in Illinois. I'm from Central Illinois, where we had Senator Percy, who was a Republican, and we had Eb Dirksen, who lived across the river from my hometown of Peoria. And those were leading Republicans. And now Illinois has only Democratic senators, but that'll change. You know, they've had lots of Republican and Democrat governors in Illinois. So these things change. And what we don't want to change is the Constitution, because America changes all the time. And we want to keep the same rules, and we want people to feel that they understand that Iowa or New Hampshire or Kansas or Wyoming or Montana don't become just so inconsequential, you know, areas where they feed people, but they have no representation.
Well, I think we're just about out of the questions that have accumulated in the queue. So I think I'd like to take this opportunity just to thank you, Michael. This was a spirited and informative session, and we'll have I guess we'll have another 3 or 4 weeks before the electors actually convene in each of the state capitals and cast their ballots. But thank you so much. It's particularly insightful, especially as we gather now and have to think about this, and we may yet have this, at least for most of our friends and colleagues and relatives, recede until 4 years from now again. But it's always with us, as you say. The Electoral College is built into the fabric of America, and it'd be difficult to think of our country without it. So thank you, Michael. We'll make sure to follow up with a recording of this program and share some of those excellent resources that you described as well. so that our friends and listeners will be able to deepen their own knowledge. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you very much, Garrett. It's been a real honor. And for those that are interested, please support the James Wilson Institute. They do fine work, and you can always donate on your way to the holidays.
Fantastic.